An influential Silicon Valley publication runs a cover story lamenting the pussification of tech. A major tech CEO lambasts of black civil rights leaders, calls for diversifying the tech workforce. Technologists rage against the PC police. No, this isn't Silicon Valley in the age of mega. It's the tech industry of the 1990s, when observers first raised concerns about the right-wing bend of Silicon Valley and the potential for technofascism. Despite the industry's, often undeserved, reputation for liberalism, its reactionary foundations were baked in almost from the beginning. As Silicon Valley enters a second Trump administration, the gendered roots of its original reactionary movement offer insight into today's rightward turn. At the height of the dot-com mania in the 1990s, many critics warned of a creeping reactionary fervor. "Forget digital utopia," wrote the longtime technology journalist Michael Malone. "We could be headed for technofascism." Elsewhere, the writer Paulina Borsuk called the Valley's worship of male power a little reminiscent of the early celebrants of Eurofascism from the 1930s. Their voices were largely drowned out by the techno-enthusiasts of the time, but Malone and Borsuk were pointing to a vision of Silicon Valley built around a reverence for unlimited male power, and a major pushback when that power was challenged. At the root of this reactionary thinking was a writer and public intellectual named George Gilder. Gilder was one of Silicon Valley's most vocal evangelists, as well as a popular futurist who forecasted coming technological trends. In 1996, he started an investment newsletter that became so popular that it generated rushes on stocks from his readers, in a process that became known as the Gilder effect. Gilder was also a longtime social conservative who brought his politics to Silicon Valley. He had first made his name in the 1970s as an anti-feminist provocateur and a mentee of the conservative stalwart William F. Buckley. At a time when women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, he wrote books that argued that traditional gender roles needed to be restored, and he blamed social issues such as poverty on the breakdown of the nuclear family. He also blamed federal welfare programs, especially those that funded single mothers, claiming they turned men into cuckolds of the state. In 1974, the National Organization for Women named him Male Chauvinist Pig of the Year. Gilder wore it as a badge of pride. At the turn of the 1980s, Gilder celebrated the links between capitalism, entrepreneurship, and the nuclear family. He claimed that entrepreneurs were the most moral and benevolent people in society because they put products into the world without a guarantee of return and then reinvested the profit back into the economy. For Gilder, entrepreneurship was also a route to rejecting the welfare state and restoring the male breadwinner role in society. He insisted that men were biologically and socially more suited to entrepreneurship than women, and that a societal emphasis on entrepreneurship could thus help restore the traditional nuclear family structure with its rigid gender breakdown. Drawing on religious language, Gilder himself was a devout Christian. He wrote that entrepreneurs are the humans who know the rules of the world and the laws of God. Gilder was far from the first person to celebrate the cultural figure of the entrepreneur, nor was he the first to link it with masculinity. As the scholar Michael Kimmel has shown, the ideal of the self-made man has been central to American conceptions of masculinity for almost 200 years. The ideal has also always been linked to the male breadwinner role in the nuclear family. More recently, in the 20th century, the economist Joseph Schumpeter had developed a theory of capitalism based around entrepreneurs, although he also had a far more pessimistic vision of capitalism, believing it would collapse over time. But at a time when American industrialism was in decline, Gilder helped revitalize a fervor for entrepreneurship and a belief in the moral power of entrepreneurs over industrial workers and company men. Increasingly, Gilder claimed that entrepreneurs were better suited to lead the country into the future than the experts found in academia or government. Gilder's 1981 book Wealth and Poverty became known as the Bible of the Reagan administration, and Reagan began incorporating praise of entrepreneurship into his own speeches. "If I didn't know better," Reagan once stated, "I would be tempted to say that entrepreneur is another word for America." Throughout the decade, Reagan used the mythology of entrepreneurship to justify trickle-down economics and cuts to federal welfare programs. That A.S. Gilder became swept up in his own ideas about entrepreneurship. He turned his attention to Silicon Valley, the burgeoning high-tech industry he began claiming was the purest expression of entrepreneurship in the world. It's not surprising that Gilder would be drawn to the tech industry in Santa Clara County, California. The state had its own powerful mythologies of masculinity and power. It was the end of the vast frontier, the end of manifest destiny. And it was the place of the former gold rush, where white men had struck it rich in the 19th century. It was also, counterintuitively, the birthplace of much of the modern conservative movement, including Reagan's political career, turning entrepreneurs into stars. Gilder was publishing his ideas at a time when IPOs were creating instant wealth for startup founders at unprecedented speeds. The new riches added to Silicon Valley's allure and seemed to underscore the draw of entrepreneurship in the world of high tech. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, other media outlets took up Gilder's framing. Tech entrepreneurs offered a hopeful way forward for the American economy, for masculinity, and for human progress writ large. Time magazine drew directly on Gilder's vision of entrepreneurship to promote the then up-and-coming businessman Steve Jobs. The 1982 cover story called Jobs one of America's risk-takers who were not only striking it rich, but also leading the U.S. into the industries of the 21st century. The article quoted Gilder, citing his claim that the potentialities of invention and enterprise are now greater than ever before in human history. Stories like this one did multiple duty for readers. They helped justify the rapidly growing wealth of a new class of tech businessmen. They inspired a new generation of readers to follow the same path, and they reinforced a cultural image of what entrepreneurs looked like, largely young, white men. This type of coverage accelerated as Silicon Valley entrepreneurs began turning from hardware to software. As the tech journalist Dave Kaplan wrote at the time, software needed neither factory to build nor natural resources to mine, just the brain matter of the entrepreneur behind the company. Tech culture increasingly gave the star treatment to young entrepreneurs whose success boiled down to a few thousand lines of computer code. Indeed, Gilder argued that software was the purest expression of entrepreneurial genius, an informational world of the mind, free from the material constraints of time and space. The mid-1990s, the media discovered a young, newly rich entrepreneur named Marc Andreessen, who had recently made millions in the IPO of his company Netscape. As an undergraduate at the University of Illinois, Andreessen was on a team that built a new, user-friendly browser for the young World Wide Web. They called it Mosaic, and it consisted of merely 9,000 lines of code, compared to the approximately 8M lines required to run Windows computers at the time. In 1994, Andreessen moved to Silicon Valley and launched a commercial version of the browser called Netscape Navigator. In 1995, Netscape went public, earning the 24-year-old Andreessen $58 million overnight. That genius, as someone genuinely deserving of